A man abandons and ignores his sick mother for years, until on his wedding day, his father arrives and says something that makes him cry in front of everyone. Rafael Beltran woke up before dawn, like every day. The apartment he lived in was small, barely furnished, and silence reigned within its walls. The city was still asleep, and the first light of the sun timidly filtered through the blinds. Despite his efforts to make it feel like home, the space couldn't hide its emptiness. There were no laughs or voices to break the stillness, only the ticking of the wall clock marking the hours that passed slowly. In the distance, the sound of the coffee machine starting up filled the air with its strong, bitter aroma. Rafael didn't get up with any enthusiasm. He did it out of habit, as if time and responsibilities were dragging him out of bed. The routine was no longer a companion, but a burden. Every morning started the same, without variation. A coffee, a few minutes in front of the mirror with a vacant look, and then to work. But if there was one thing that never changed, it was the shadow that followed him. The Beltran restaurant, a family legacy that, instead of feeling like an inheritance, had become his prison. The restaurant had been the center of his life when he was a child, a place filled with laughter, customers sharing stories, and waiters rushing around. The walls, adorned with yellowed photos, showed a happy family and a prosperous business. But today, the restaurant was something else. Empty tables stared at him from the main dining room. The echo of Rafael's footsteps reverberated through the empty dining area, and the clock, always punctual, marked the passage of time without mercy. The customers were gone, and with them, the energy that had once filled that place. The restaurant was now just an obligation, a financial burden that consumed him more each day. Rafael spent hours locked in the restaurant's office, surrounded by papers, overdue bills, and suppliers, insisting he pay his debts. The numbers didn't add up, the debts piled up, and the pressure was unbearable. Every day, instead of finding solutions, it seemed like the problems multiplied. How had he come to this point? How had he let the restaurant, his family's legacy, turn into a source of despair? Far away, the image of his daughter, Casey, 15 years old, appeared in his thoughts. She spent her afternoons at home, alone, because Rafael was almost never there. The distance between them grew every day, but he didn't know how to approach her. He didn't know how to talk to her, how to return the joy they once shared. The afternoons they used to spend playing or talking had disappeared in the heavy air of his indifference. Casey, now more mature than a teenager should be, understood that her father was no longer the man she used to count on. He had become a shadow of himself, a man trapped in his own maze of debts and frustrations. But the place that reflected Rafael's emptiness the most wasn't the restaurant or his apartment, but the nursing home where his mother, Mary, lived. Alzheimer's had taken away the woman who had once been the pillar of the family. Mary, who had been the life of family gatherings, the one who took care of every detail in the restaurant, was now lost in the corners of her mind. The disease had erased her essence, and Rafael, unable to face that reality, had stopped visiting her. His visits became increasingly rare, more distant, because confronting what was left of her was too painful. He preferred to keep himself busy, immersed in the mechanics of the restaurant, rather than face the pain his mother caused him. Nino, his father, however, never abandoned his wife. Every day, after his shift at the restaurant, Nino would go to the nursing home with fresh flowers, a smile that seemed to hold all the love he still offered Mary. And while he whispered stories of their youth to her, as if they could still share those old moments, Rafael stood there, watching in silence from a distance, unable to move, unable to reconnect with the memories that had once been so happy. Nights were the hardest. After another day of work, Rafael would return to the restaurant to check inventories, deal with suppliers, and sort through papers that never seemed to decrease. His mind could not rest. The hours stretched in the dim light of the office, with the hum of the air conditioning and the cold coffee as his only companions. He thought about his mother, his daughter, everything he had lost. but he didn't know how to break free from the spiral. He was trapped in the past, looking at the photographs of the restaurant that decorated the office walls, but unable to do anything about it. The burden of keeping the business afloat kept him a slave to his own fate. Time, so relentless and cruel, had left him there, alone, surrounded by the remnants of a life he no longer recognized as his own. The debts grew, his relationship with Casey faded, and his mother, the woman who had once raised him with so much love, now called him without words. Raphael had forgotten what family meant. He had forgotten what love meant. But sometimes, in the darkest moments, when the loneliness was deepest, Raphael wondered, what if all of this changed? What if he could find his way back to the people he loved most? Unknowingly, something was about to happen that would make all of this possible. Pain appeared suddenly. It wasn't a symptom Raphael could ignore, nor even a passing discomfort. It was a sharp, piercing pain that began in his chest and coursed through him with such intensity that it left him breathless. He tried to brush it off at first, as he always did with his own ailments. He forced himself to stay focused on the papers in front of him, overdue bills, accounts to pay, suppliers desperate for their money. But the pain intensified with each passing second, until finally, unable to stop it, he collapsed onto the office floor, his gaze lost in the chaos surrounding him. The echo of his fall resonated off the walls of the empty office, but no one was there to hear it, to help him. It was just him and the relentless pain that made him feel more fragile than ever. In that moment, he realized something he had ignored for years. His body could no longer bear the weight of his decisions, of his omissions. The pressure he carried within himself, the accumulated anxiety, everything he had been ignoring in hopes it would disappear, had finally found its moment to explode. Raphael tried to get up, but his body didn't respond. The only thing he could do was lie there, looking at the old photographs that adorned the restaurant's walls, images of times gone by when the business was thriving and the family was united. Each one of those photos seemed like a dagger lodged in his chest, reminding him of what he had lost, what he had left behind. The memories flooded him with overwhelming force, but he couldn't process them. He was too tired, too trapped in his own world to see beyond the anxiety and guilt that consumed him. After what seemed like hours, a distant sound woke him. It was the tone of his cell phone, the insistent, familiar sound of missed calls. Nino, his father, had tried to contact him several times. Raphael, with difficulty, managed to answer. "Rafa?" Nino's voice sounded worried on the other end. "Are you okay, son? I've called you several times." Raphael tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come out. Finally, he forced an answer, although it was barely audible. His voice was hoarse, weak. "I'm fine, Dad. Just a bit of stress, I think." Nino, however, wasn't fooled by his son's empty words. He had lived long enough to know when something was wrong. "Raphael, you're not the only one carrying the weight of the family on your shoulders. Stop carrying it all alone. Why don't you come home? Let's talk." Reluctantly, Raphael agreed to leave the restaurant. He needed to get out, even if it was just for a little while. The daylight was already fading when he arrived at his father's home, a place that, though welcoming, didn't feel like his own. He entered and sat on the usual couch while Nino made coffee, as he had done since Raphael could remember. Nino sat across from him, silent, watching his son with a concern he no longer tried to hide. Raphael, for his part, just stared at the coffee cups on the table without the desire to say a word. Finally, Nino broke the silence, his voice soft but firm. "You know, every time you come to see me, it feels like you're farther away. Not just from the restaurant, from everything. From your mother, from Casey, from me. I don't know if it's fear or pride, but something is pulling you away. And it's not fair to anyone, especially to you." Raphael didn't answer. His mind was still trapped in the maze of worries, debts, bills, The weight of responsibilities still crushed him. "I know what it's like to be overwhelmed, son," Nino continued. "I've lived it, and I'll keep living it as long as the business goes on. But you can't keep ignoring your mother. You can't keep ignoring Casey. What's left of your mother, what's left of your family, you won't find it in bills or accounts to pay. And I'm telling you this because I know what it's like to lose everything. I've watched your mother slowly fall apart, and I don't want you to end up the same." Raphael finally looked up, his eyes filled with anguish and frustration. His words came out with difficulty. "And what am I supposed to do, Dad? What can I do? I've lost so much. I've lost the restaurant. I've lost Mom. I've lost contact with Casey. I don't even know where to start." Nino looked at him steadily, then, in a whisper, said something that would change the course of the coming days. "You know what would mean the most to your mother? A wedding. Your mother's wish, before the disease took her memories, was always to have one last happy moment with us. She wanted a wedding, Raphael. A wedding with her love. One last memory of the life she shared with me. If you can do that for her, for us, maybe it'll be the first step toward finding what you've lost." Raphael remained silent, his body tense, his heart racing, trying to process what he had just heard. A wedding. How could he think about something so trivial when his world was falling apart? But his father's words struck him hard. Love, family. How long had it been since he thought about those concepts? How long had he ignored the one bond that could save him from himself? After a long silence, Raphael nodded, feeling a knot in his chest. "I'll do what I can, Dad. For Mum." The following days, Raphael lived in a haze of exhaustion and confusion. The weight of the restaurant still crushed his chest, while his father's words about Mary's wedding echoed in his mind. How could he carry out something so emotional when his life was in pieces? The restaurant was on the verge of collapse, debts piled up relentlessly, and deep within him, Raphael knew there was no easy escape. But his father's request, simple yet so full of meaning, made him pause for a moment. What would his mother have left if he didn't give her one last happy memory? Raphael spent the days organizing the details in his mind, trying to find a reason to reject the idea. Every time he thought of the wedding, an uncomfortable feeling washed over him. He couldn't help but think that, in the middle of the chaos that was his life, organizing something so emotionally charged would be an impossible task. Yet, his father's face, Nino, kept appearing before him. The father who had given his life to the business, who had endured life's hardships without complaint, now asking for a gesture of love for his mother. That request could not be ignored. For days, Raphael tried to delay the conversation with Nino, evading the topic with excuses about the restaurant and its financial problems. But he knew he couldn't keep doing this. One afternoon, after several attempts to distract himself with the restaurant papers, he gathered the courage and decided to face the situation. He called his father, who immediately agreed to meet. That afternoon, Raphael went to Nino's house. The city was already dark when he arrived, and the dim light from the kitchen illuminated the small house. Nino was sitting in his usual chair, a cup of coffee in his hands, waiting for his son, as he always did. The routine between them had been almost constant, but this time, the atmosphere felt charged with something more, something palpable, a need to close a chapter. Raphael sat across from him, feeling the weight of the conversation he was about to have. The two of them sat in silence for a moment, unsure of where to begin. Finally, Nino broke the silence with his usual calm tone. "Have you thought about it, son? Mom's wedding?" Raphael sighed deeply, unsure how to express all that he was feeling. The idea of a wedding for his mother in her state seemed so unreal, almost cruel. Mary's illness had erased so much of her that any attempt to recreate something so meaningful seemed futile. But the love Nino showed for his wife every day was unshakable, a reminder of what true devotion meant. "I've thought about it, Dad, but..." Raphael hesitated, searching for the right words. How are we supposed to do something like this? My mom is no longer the same. I'm not sure it will make sense. I don't know if I can do this. Nino looked at him intently, his tired eyes filled with wisdom. I'm not doing this for you or for me, son. I'm doing it for her. She still has memories, even if they're few. And that day, even if brief, could give her something her soul needs. And I'm doing this for you too, so you can understand what really matters in this world. The debts, the restaurant, all that will fade away. But family, love, those are the pillars that will support you when everything else falls. Raphael remained silent, contemplating his father's words. He knew he was right, but fear kept him paralyzed. How was he going to face his mother in that state? How would he bear seeing her so fragile, so far from the woman he remembered? Nino, as if he had read his thoughts, continued in a soft, almost whispering voice. I know it's not easy, son. I feel lost many times too. But remember, when you're willing to give everything for someone, even what seems impossible, in the end, you'll receive the rewards. That wedding isn't just for her. It's for all of us. It's an opportunity to heal what's been broken, to remind us what really matters. You don't have to do this alone. Raphael felt a sharp pain in his chest. His father's love and wisdom overwhelmed him, and a timid tear rolled down his cheek. For the first time in a long while, he began to feel something other than despair, a small glimmer of hope. I'll do what I can, Dad. If Mom really wants this, I'll try. Raphael's voice sounded firmer than he had expected. Nino nodded with a tired but satisfied smile. He then placed his coffee cup on the table and stood up to hug his son, something he rarely did. But in that moment, it seemed necessary. I promise it will help you, son. Not just Mom, but you too. That night, as Raphael returned to his apartment, the city seemed quieter than usual. The weight of decisions still pressed on him, but for the first time in a long while, he began to see a sliver of light in his life. His mother's wedding would not only be a way to give her one last moment of happiness, but also an opportunity for him to reconnect with what he had lost: his family, his love, and maybe even himself. The following days, Raphael moved through a fog of uncertainty. He had accepted his father's request, though he still couldn't understand how something as simple as a wedding could change anything. But somehow, something inside him urged him to keep going. Maybe it was the love his father had shown him, or maybe, at last, it was time to face what he had been avoiding for so long. What remained of his mother. It was a cloudy afternoon when Raphael decided to visit Mary at the nursing home. He had postponed it again and again, but his mother's wedding kept haunting his thoughts, and the weight of his promise to Nino pushed him to take the step. When he arrived at the nursing home, the light of day filtered timidly through the windows, casting soft shadows on the hallways. The smell of cleanliness and disinfectant filled the air, something that unsettled Raphael. This was not a place for someone like his mother, someone who had once been so full of life, so full of love. He walked down the hall with hesitant steps, as if the walls could absorb his pain and guilt. Each time he had visited, Mary's condition had worsened. Alzheimer's had slowly devoured her, leaving her lost in her own body. But that afternoon, something felt different. The nursing home, with its residents who barely recognized strangers, was strangely quiet. Perhaps, Raphael thought, this was the right moment to face what he had been avoiding. When he reached his mother's room, Raphael stopped. The sound of the television in Mary's room played in the background, but there was no other noise. He took a deep breath and finally knocked on the door. "Come in." He heard the soft voice of the nurse who was with her. Elena, the nurse who had always cared for his mother, opened the door with a warm smile. "Hello, Raphael," Elena said gently, her kind eyes reflecting understanding. "Mary is resting, but I'll let her know you're here." Elena stepped aside to let him enter, and Raphael took a step into the room. Mary was sitting by the window, a blanket over her legs, her hair messily gathered. Her eyes, though clouded by the disease, fixed on him for a moment, as if trying to recognize him. That uncertainty in her eyes hit Raphael with a force that almost knocked him to the ground. Mary raised a trembling hand and reached out to him, as if she could still remember the affection they once shared. Her skin was thin, fragile, as if any touch could break it. In that moment, Raphael felt his chest tighten, the guilt enveloping him. Everything he had avoided for years, all the distance he had placed between them, felt like a weight pulling him to the ground. Without a word, he slowly approached and took her hand. "Mom." Raphael's voice broke, unable to bear the pain that overwhelmed him. He didn't know what else to say. The words escaped him, choking in his throat, drowned by the pressure of sadness and regret. Mary, however, didn't respond with words, but with a lost look that, for a brief moment, seemed to light up with a spark of recognition. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. For an instant, it seemed like his mother saw him, that she could remember something from her life, even if only for a moment. In her eyes, there was a glimmer of love, of affection, that cut through the fog of the disease. Raphael couldn't hold back his tears. The guilt overtook him with devastating force. How had he let it come to this? How could he have abandoned her when she needed him most? The image of his mother, now so fragile, was a direct blow to his heart. It was too late to turn back, but in that moment, something inside him began to change. The indifference, the distance he had placed between himself and his family, began to crumble. "Mum, I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice broken as he gently stroked her hand. "I promise I'll try. I promise I'll do what I can to make you happy, just like you always did for me." Mary, as if she could still hear him through the haze of the disease, squeezed his hand a little harder. Her eyes closed slowly, and Raphael's face filled, with tears that fell uncontrollably. It was at that moment that he understood what it really meant to be a son, what family truly meant. It was something he had ignored for years, something he was just beginning to understand in its full depth. Eleanor, who had been watching silently, approached softly and placed a hand on Raphael's shoulder. "She knows you're here, Raphael. In her own way, she knows." Elena spoke with a calmness that, for some reason, comforted him. "Don't worry about what you can't change. Just do what you can now. That's what she needs. That's what we all need." Raphael nodded without saying anything more. He stayed there, next to his mother, for a few minutes that felt like hours. He felt the weight of memories, the weight of moments that could never be recovered. But he also felt something new, a purpose. A small spark of hope, no matter how small, ignited in his heart. Something had awakened in him, something that had remained dormant for too many years. Finally, he stood up with a deep sigh and said goodbye to his mother. He had no answers for her, no promises he could fulfill right away. But in his heart, something had changed. He was no longer the man who had entered that room. Something in his soul, though wounded, was beginning to heal. As he left the room, he paused for a moment, looking at his mother one last time, and he saw her with a gaze full of love and regret. The wedding, though it still seemed like a ridiculous idea, now had a new meaning. It was the first step toward a life Raphael no longer wanted to let slip away. He knew there was still much to be done, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone. The cold morning air hit Raphael's face as he left the nursing home, but he didn't mind. He had spent so much time there, in his mother's room, watching as the disease took away each part of her, and he couldn't shake the image of her fragile face and the tears that had burned his eyes. What was clear to him after the visit was that something inside him had changed. Perhaps it was too late to repair everything he had broken, but he couldn't stand still. He had to try. That afternoon, sitting in his office at the restaurant, Raphael reviewed the accounts and invoices, but his mind was elsewhere. His mother's wedding no longer seemed absurd. After all, it was the last thing she wanted, the last gift he could still give her. And maybe, just maybe, it was also his own chance to reconnect with what he had lost. The idea of organizing it terrified him, but something deep inside told him he had to do it, even if he didn't know how. The phone call from Nino pulled him from his thoughts. "How's everything, son?" His father's voice came through the phone, warm, but also filled with anxiety. He knew this step wasn't easy for Raphael. Raphael took a deep breath before responding, looking at the stack of papers on the table. "I'm working on it, Dad. I've got some ideas. I want it to be special for Mom. I'll do it, I promise." Nino, on the other end of the line, let out a breath of relief. "That gives me hope, son. Thank you." Raphael hung up the phone, his mind returning to the difficulties. The restaurant was still a mess, and the idea of organizing a wedding with debts hanging over him felt like madness. But he decided that he couldn't let everything else get in the way of what truly mattered. If he didn't do something now, he never would. The wedding had to happen. For his mother, for his father, for himself. The following weeks were a mix of stress and chaos. With Nino's support, Raphael began to organize the wedding with an approach he never would have imagined. Despite his initial confusion, little by little, he began to feel that this wasn't just a task he had to fulfill, but a way to rebuild his connection with his mother, with his family. The church where he and Casey had gotten married, the same one where his parents had celebrated their marriage, was chosen as the perfect place. A place with history, filled with both good and painful memories. As the days went on, his conversations with Elena, the nurse who had taken care of his mother for so long, became more frequent. At first, Raphael saw her as someone distant, just a caregiver. But as the situation progressed, he began to realize that Elena was much more than that. She was a kind woman with infinite patience, but also with a deep understanding of what he was going through. Their talks about patient care, about what it really meant to offer support to those who needed it, began to resonate deeply within him. Elena had not only become a pillar for his mother, but in a way, she was also helping to heal Raphael. "She still remembers you, Raphael," Elena would tell him every time he visited the nursing home. "She does, in her own way, even though it's not always clear. Sometimes, when you see her looking at you like that, it's not that she doesn't recognize you, it's just that her memories come and go. But it doesn't matter. What counts is what you can give her now, and that's what you're doing." Those words, though simple, made him feel less alone. Elena saw him in a way he had stopped seeing himself. The distance between him and his mother, so deep in his mind, was slowly beginning to fade, as if the broken pieces of a puzzle were starting to fit together again. And though the wedding still seemed crazy amid all of it, he began to understand that this act of love, no matter how small, had immense value. One day, while he was organizing the last details of the ceremony, Raphael received a visit from Casey, his daughter. She had been more present lately, always waiting for her father to make some step toward her. Their relationship, though still somewhat broken, was beginning to heal slowly. Casey was changing, becoming a more mature young woman, and Raphael, though still filled with uncertainty, began to see flashes of the daughter he once knew. "Dad, I want you to know that what you're doing for Mom, for Grandma, it's not just for her, it's for all of us. And even though I don't say it, I want everything to go well. I support you." Those words were a balm for Raphael. His daughter, despite the past wounds, was willing to stand by him. Finally, after so many years of emotional distance, he was beginning to see the possibility of reconciliation, of a more united family. The efforts he was putting into his mother's wedding, though difficult, were also mending the broken bond with his daughter. As the days passed quickly, preparations for Mary and Nino's wedding began to take shape. The flowers were ordered, the priest contacted, and the guest list slowly grew. Raphael still felt the pressure of the restaurant's debts, but now there was something bigger driving him forward. The idea of seeing his mother smile, even if just for a day, gave him the strength to keep going. It was curious how, amidst so much chaos, something as simple as a wedding could make everything seem to make sense. Raphael, who had lost the ability to find joy in his daily life, began to experience, for the first time in a long while, a sense of purpose. He was not just organizing a wedding for his mother, he was starting to rebuild the pieces of a life he had forgotten could be lived with love, gratitude, and hope. The wedding wouldn't just be a gift for his mother, but also for him, for his family, for all those, like him, who had been wasting time in the noise of everyday life, forgetting what truly mattered. The days leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of activity and stress. Raphael found himself trapped between the restaurant, the bills to pay, and the preparations for the ceremony. Every time he thought he had made progress, something new came up. An urgent complaint from a supplier, a call from a creditor, or some wedding detail that needed to be resolved. However, something had changed in him. Amidst the confusion, he realized he wasn't just fulfilling a promise to his father, he was also starting to fulfill a promise to himself, to reconnect with his family. One afternoon, while reviewing the wedding details in the small office of the restaurant, Casey entered quietly. Her footsteps were soft, but Raphael, lost in the pile of papers, didn't see her coming. She was the one who spoke first, with a soft voice, but one that carried deep meaning. "Dad, can I talk to you?" Raphael looked up, surprised. For years, he had been the one avoiding any meaningful conversation, and now Casey, at 15, was looking at him with the serenity of someone who had had to mature too quickly. He didn't know how this moment had arrived, but the tension between them, though still present, was beginning to fade. "Sure, Casey. What's up?" She took a few steps toward him and sat down in front of his desk. Her eyes, more serious than ever, never left his. "I want you to know something, Dad. I didn't understand before, but now I do. All of this with the wedding. I know it's not just for Grandma. I know it's important for you, too. And I want to be there, help you. I don't know much about these things, but if you let me, I'd like us to do this together. I don't feel so far away from you anymore, Dad." Raphael felt a knot in his stomach, something he hadn't experienced in years. His daughter's promise, so simple and yet so deep, touched his heart with the force of a wave. The fact that Casey offered him her support, that she wanted to be part of the solution, was something he had never expected. Finally, after so much time, he felt there was a chance to heal old wounds. "Thank you, Casey." His voice came out more broken than he intended, but he said it sincerely. "It feels good to know you're here. And of course, I want you to help me. This wouldn't make sense without you." They looked at each other in silence for a few seconds, as if words were no longer necessary. Casey, with her usual maturity and ability to see beyond appearances, understood that this wasn't just about a wedding. It was about rebuilding something that had been lost over the years. It was about Raphael becoming the father she had always needed, about the family trying to piece together what had been destroyed by indifference, fear, and pride. From that conversation onward, the following days were different. Casey began to get involved in the small details of the wedding, helping her father with the preparations. From choosing the flowers to decorating the church, Casey was there, supporting her father every step of the way. Their relationship became more fluid, more natural. The laughter Raphael had heard as a child began to return, and although he couldn't erase all the lost years, he felt that something new, something worth nurturing, was blossoming. Elena, the nurse who had become his unwavering support, also played a crucial role. The visits to Mary, sometimes with her mother so distant, sometimes so present, became less painful. With each visit, Raphael began to understand that he couldn't only cling to what his mother had been, but also to what she still represented for him. Every moment spent with her, though brief, allowed him to reconnect with a part of himself that had been dormant for years. Elena, seeing the change in Raphael, was always available, ready to offer words of support or even a smile when things seemed to crumble. "What you're doing isn't easy, Raphael, but you're making the best decision, not just for her, but for yourself as well. The wedding isn't just an act of love for your mother. It's a way to heal, to remind yourself of what really matters. You don't have to do this alone." Despite the pressure of the restaurant and the debt still looming, Raphael began to feel lighter. The weight of decisions, though still present, no longer crushed him like before. His daughter's love and Elena's words reminded him of what he had around him. A family ready to rebuild, an opportunity for redemption. And though everything was still standing, he no longer felt so alone. At the restaurant, the employees began to notice the change. Raphael, who had once sunk into discouragement and despair, now seemed more present, more willing to lead with a renewed attitude. Though there were still problems to solve, something had changed inside him. He no longer only thought about bills and the uncertain future of the restaurant. He was beginning to think about the future of his family. It was as if, for the first time in years, he had found a purpose beyond the walls of the restaurant. His mother's wedding was transforming him, bringing him closer to the people who truly mattered in his life. The day of Mary and Nino's wedding approached, and Raphael felt that, even though difficulties remained, there was something new in his life motivating him to move forward. Every step he took in organizing the wedding, every detail he resolved with Casey, brought him closer to the family he had lost, but was now slowly starting to rebuild. It was the beginning of something new, not just for his mother, but also for him, for all of them. The day of Mary and Nino's wedding arrived with a calmness that seemed out of place, as if the universe had decided to gift them, for once, a peaceful day. The church, an ancient stone building with stained glass windows that told stories of past centuries, was decorated with white flowers and lilies, a mix of simplicity and elegance that captured the essence of what they wanted to achieve. A genuine moment, full of love and dignity, that would serve as a final tribute to their parents' shared life. For Raphael, that event, though a symbol of what had been lost, also represented the possibility of redemption. The morning began early. Raphael, with a somewhat tired but determined face, woke up earlier than usual, feeling that the day would be more than just another step in his mother's life. He was the first to arrive at the church, ensuring everything was in place, the music, the flowers, the small details that, despite everything, had to be perfect. The atmosphere was filled with a sense of anticipation, of something being carefully built, yet carrying with it an emotional weight that was difficult to describe. Casey, though young, appeared more mature than ever. She stood by his side, helping with every detail, always with a smile that, though nervous, displayed a strength Raphael hardly recognized. He watched her from the corner of his eye as he prepared the place, remembering the times he had seen her as a little girl. Now, on the eve of his mother's wedding, he saw in her a young woman capable of helping rebuild what had, in his heart, been broken so long ago. Casey handed him a rose that was to be placed at the altar, and in that small gesture, Raphael felt a glimpse of what could be a new connection between them. The ceremony would begin at 3 in the afternoon. After finishing the last details, Raphael stepped away to put on his suit. In the mirror of the dressing room, as he adjusted his tie, he saw a man he no longer fully recognized, but who, somehow, was also himself. It wasn't just about the occasion, nor the ceremony itself. It was about the person he was becoming, someone ready to face the past and the future with a new perspective. He was no longer the son who had abandoned his mother. He was someone who, at last, saw what truly mattered. When the first guests arrived, nervousness began to take over the church. The place gradually filled, but the most important moment was still to come: the arrival of Mary. Raphael moved to the altar, where Nino waited, calmer than ever, with that serenity only a lifetime of shared experience could bring. Nino, with his usual hat and slightly trembling hands, gave his son a glance, a look that said more than words ever could. The love for his wife, for the family, for what was about to happen, was evident in every gesture. Raphael, despite his own mixed emotions, felt reconnected with something much larger than the concern over the restaurant's future, the debts that still haunted them, or the problems that had yet to be solved. That moment, that wedding, gave him the chance to put everything into perspective. Maybe he couldn't change the past, but he could give his mother, his family, a dignified farewell, one last moment of love and joy. Finally, the church doors opened, and everyone stood up, expectant. Mary appeared, escorted by Elena, the nurse who had cared for her with such dedication and affection, something Raphael had come to value deeply. Elena, with a serene smile, supported his mother as she walked slowly down the aisle, with the fragility that the disease had left her, but with her dignity intact. Her simple white dress shone in the light, filtering through the stained glass windows. Mary was no longer the woman she had once been, but in her face, in the way she held Nino's hand with such love, the woman she had been reflected, a mother, a wife, a woman of family. Raphael watched the scene from the altar. His mother's eyes, though clouded by Alzheimer's, met his for a brief moment. It was a fleeting recognition, but enough. It wasn't a clear gaze, nor a complete smile, but something inside him broke and rebuilt itself in that second. His mother's love was still there, even in the fog of the disease, and that was the last time he saw her so fully, so completely. The ceremony began, and the priest spoke of love and perseverance, of the importance of promises made in difficult times. His words resonated in Raphael with an unexpected force. For so many years, he had believed that love was something that simply happened, something easy, found in happy moments. But there, at the altar, amidst the fragility of his mother, amidst Nino's love for her, Raphael understood something much deeper. Love wasn't always bright or easy. Sometimes, love was persistence, holding firm when everything seemed to fall apart. When it was time for the vows, Nino leaned toward Mary, his voice broken but clear, and pronounced his words with a devotion that would never fade, no matter what the disease did to his wife. Mary, in her condition, squeezed Nino's hand with the same strength she had used throughout her life. And in that grip, Raphael understood something vital. Love, despite everything, remained an act of faith, an act of resistance. It was a commitment that didn't fade, didn't disappear with time or disease. The ceremony ended, and applause filled the church, soft but full of emotion. The eyes of those present were moist, but the smiles were wide. Life continued, and love remained the anchor that kept them afloat. Raphael approached his mother, now a little more relieved. She, seated in her chair, looked at him again. Though her eyes no longer shone with the lucidity of before, there was something in her face that was unmistakable: the love of a mother. In that moment, Raphael understood that, even though memories might be lost, what truly mattered was the love that remained. With a deep sigh, Raphael walked toward Casey and hugged her with a tenderness he had never shown before. That wedding had been more than just an event. It was a bridge, an opportunity to rediscover what it meant to be family, to be human, to finally be free to love. The day after Mary and Nino's wedding, the church still vibrated with the emotion of what had happened. The event had been a success, beyond what Raphael had expected, but what surprised him the most was the impact it had on himself. At first, he had organized everything out of obligation, for love of his father, and as a final gesture of affection for his mother. However, in the end, he realized that the wedding had been much more than just a simple event. It was an open window to a new beginning, an opportunity for him to rediscover the true meaning of family. When the last guests had left and the church was empty, Raphael stood before the altar, looking at the still empty pews and the flowers that were beginning to wilt. A feeling of peace washed over him, but so did a deep pain. His mother's fragility, his father's clarity, and Casey's shy embrace. Everything had touched him so deeply that he couldn't stop reflecting. In his mind, the images of the wedding blended with memories of his childhood, of a house full of life, of Sunday afternoons at the restaurant with his mother and father smiling, as if time never passed. Despite the mixed feelings, Raphael knew that something inside him had changed forever. The idea that he had been able to give his parents that last moment of happiness filled him with a silent gratitude. He had done something right, even though he couldn't erase all the mistakes made over the years. The weight of guilt was still there, but now, for the first time in a long time, he felt he had taken a step toward redemption. That same night, after the wedding, Raphael spent some time with Casey at the restaurant. Although the business remained a source of anxiety, there was something different in the way they related to each other. Casey, who had once been absorbed in her schoolwork and her world separate from her father's, was now closer to him. There was something in her posture, in her words, that showed a new understanding between them. "Dad, have you realized what you did today?" Casey asked as they sat together at one of the empty tables in the restaurant, surrounded by the usual stillness that typically filled the space. Raphael looked up at her, surprised by her question. "What do you mean?" he replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "You didn't just organize the wedding for Mom, you did it for yourself, for us. What you did today wasn't just a gesture for Mom, it was for you, and for me too. Maybe you never said it, but today I saw a part of you I haven't seen in a long time." Raphael stared at her in silence, surprised by the maturity his daughter was showing. For so long, he had wanted to ignore the distance he had put between them, but now he realized that Casey had been watching him all this time, waiting for him to take the first step. "I don't know, Casey. For so long, I felt lost, like there was no way out. But today, when I saw Mom smile, even just a little, when I saw your grandfather so happy, I realized there was something more I needed to do. And not just for them, but for myself too. I think I never really understood what mattered until now." Casey smiled, a sincere gesture that reflected a bit of hope. "It's strange, isn't it? All of this. But I think now I understand that you don't have to wait for everything to be perfect to start healing. Sometimes you just have to take the first step, even if you don't know how. What matters is to keep moving forward. And, Dad, you've done that." Raphael looked at her in silence. His daughter had matured far faster than he had imagined. The pain from the lost years still overwhelmed him, but there was also something new in his heart, something that urged him to continue. It was no longer just about saving the restaurant or fixing the financial problems still weighing on his life. It was about rebuilding the human connections he had left behind, about learning to value them again. The day that had started with a sense of obligation had now transformed into a reminder of what it truly meant to be family. Deep down, Raphael knew that he couldn't change everything that had happened, nor erase the scars of the past, but he also understood that the only thing that really mattered was how he chose to move forward. He couldn't keep searching for solutions in the business or in the debts. The only thing that could truly heal was his relationship with his daughter, with his mother, with his father, and with the people around him. The days that followed the wedding were a mix of subtle changes. Raphael, though still facing the economic difficulties of the restaurant, began to make different decisions. He no longer saw the restaurant only as a business he had to save, but as a place where he could start over. He began involving Casey in the decisions about the restaurant, making her feel that her opinion mattered. The problems didn't disappear immediately, but the feeling that he had his family by his side, that his relationship with Casey and Nino was starting to be restored, motivated him. Elena also continued to be a support for Raphael, both in his relationship with his mother and in his own healing process. Though the restaurant was still struggling, Raphael now saw Elena as more than just a caregiver. She had become a constant presence, someone who not only cared for his mother, but also helped him find the balance he had been seeking. Their conversations grew deeper, more meaningful. Elena wasn't just there for his mother. She was also there for him. And slowly, Raphael began to understand that sometimes salvation didn't come through immediate solutions, but through small, constant acts of love. Life went on, but Raphael no longer saw it the same way. Although the restaurant's problems still existed, he no longer saw them as insurmountable. He had rediscovered what truly mattered: family, love, connection. He had taken the first step toward redemption, and he knew that, although the path would still be long, he was no longer alone. After the wedding, Raphael didn't allow himself much time to rest. Although he had found solace in the small moments with Casey and the satisfaction of giving his mother a dignified farewell, the problems of the restaurant remained unsolved. The debts didn't go away, creditors kept calling incessantly, and as always, the numbers didn't add up. It was a constant shadow that threatened to consume him once again. But this time, there was something different. Although the pressures were still as heavy as before, Raphael was no longer alone in it. There was a new determination in his heart, a renewed sense of purpose, something telling him that he couldn't give up, not for himself, but for what was still left to heal in his life. One cold morning, after a sleepless night, Raphael arrived early at the restaurant. The dishes in the kitchen were stacked up, the tables were empty, and the invoices still sat on his desk, waiting to be addressed. He sat down in front of his computer, his gaze fixed on the screen. Every number seemed like a reminder of failure, but something kept him there. In his mind, the memories of his parents' wedding intertwined with the bills to pay, the conversations he had had with Casey, and the eyes of his mother, so full of love, even though they were absent. Raphael knew the business needed a change. He had been procrastinating, watching everything crumble around him, but now he couldn't ignore it any longer. The restaurant needed a transformation, something that would attract more customers, something that would give it life again. The days of waiting for things to get better on their own were over. It was time to act. That's when, almost unexpectedly, Elena showed up at the restaurant. She had come to drop off some documents from the clinic, but when she entered, she saw the atmosphere laden with tension and the evident worry on Raphael's face. Although she knew he had been going through difficulties, she had never seen that burden so visibly present. She walked over to him with her usual calmness and sat down beside him. "Raphael, why don't you talk about it? You can't carry all this on your own," she said softly, making him feel more vulnerable than he had expected. Elena's mere presence, her constant support, seemed to make the burden a little more bearable. Raphael sighed, staring at the computer screen, unable to process the numbers. He knew that, as much as he wished, he couldn't solve everything on his own. "It's hard, Elena. The restaurant isn't making enough, the debts keep growing, and I don't know if I'll be able to keep it afloat. All of this is drowning me, and the wedding made me realize I've been distancing myself from what really matters. But the business is still here, and I don't know how to make it work." Elena looked at him in silence for a few seconds, as if carefully considering his words. Finally, she spoke firmly. "You have a family, Raphael, and what you did for your mother, your father, and Casey wasn't just an act of love. It was a reminder of what really matters. The restaurant is important, of course, but it's not the only thing you have. Sometimes the best way to solve what seems impossible is to surround yourself with those who support you. I don't know much about restaurants, but I do know about the importance of community. Maybe it's time to see this from a different angle. Why not try involving more people from the neighborhood? A restaurant isn't just a business. It's a gathering place. If you reconnect with the community, maybe you can see the change." Elena's words struck a deep chord with Raphael. Up until that point, the restaurant had only been a burden, a heavy legacy that he had to keep afloat. But, just as Elena suggested, what if the solution wasn't just in the numbers, but in the people? The restaurant had been a place where stories and laughter were shared, a space for community. Maybe, just maybe, that same community could save it. Determined to try something new, Raphael spent the afternoon thinking about how he could involve the community in his business. He began writing some ideas down: new promotions, event nights, and perhaps even a series of themed dinners to attract the neighbors. He wanted the restaurant to become a place where people didn't just come for the food, but for the connection, for the family atmosphere it once had. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. The next morning, he called Casey and asked her to help him with a new proposal to revitalize the restaurant. Casey, who had only helped with the wedding preparations and small tasks at the restaurant, was surprised but agreed enthusiastically. Together, they began planning special nights at the restaurant: a traditional food night, a neighborhood storytelling night, and a live music night. Raphael was nervous, but also excited. It was a risk, but he felt it was what he needed to do. Eleanor was also there to support the new initiative, and with her knowledge of the community, she helped organize small events and contacted local musicians to give an authentic touch to the proposal. During those weeks, the tension at the restaurant began to ease a little. Customers started coming back, drawn by the idea of being part of a community space again. The events began filling the tables, and the laughter, which had been absent for so long, began to fill the air. Though the financial problems were still present, Raphael no longer saw them in the same light. He was no longer just a man trapped by debts. He was a man surrounded by his family, his daughter, his father, Eleanor, and the community, helping him rise. Slowly, he began to realize that the business wasn't just about money. It was about building relationships, creating something that transcended the numbers. Despite the ongoing uncertainty about the future, Raphael felt that he was regaining something important. The nights at the restaurant were no longer just work-filled nights, but nights full of life, connection, and hope. The problems didn't disappear immediately, but for the first time in a long time, Raphael began to believe that, with the right support and the right attitude, difficulties could be overcome. With a new focus in his mind and heart, Raphael took the first step toward true healing. He had rediscovered the value of community and family love. And although the challenges still remained, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. Over the weeks that followed, Raphael began to notice a transformation he hadn't expected. The restaurant, once a symbol of failure and frustration, started to regain some of its former vitality. The themed nights, special dinners with neighborhood stories, and live music started attracting more customers. What had begun as an urgent need to save the business was turning into something much more meaningful, a space for connection, for community, and perhaps redemption. Casey had become increasingly involved in the restaurant. Although she was still young, her creativity and enthusiasm had become an essential part of the business's rebirth. She was the soul of the event nights, suggesting new ideas and helping organize the special dinners. She wasn't just helping her father with tasks anymore. Her presence was beginning to fill the restaurant with a fresh energy that had been lacking for a long time. Their relationship had improved significantly. Sometimes, while they rearranged tables or laughed with the customers, Raphael would stop for a moment to observe his daughter. He realized how much she had changed in such a short time. Casey was no longer just the distant, reserved young girl she had been. Now she was an ally, a friend, and most importantly, someone he could trust, not only with the business, but with the rebuilding of their relationship. Elena also continued to be a key presence in the process. Although her role as his mother's nurse remained essential, she had started helping out with the restaurant events. She brought ideas about how to create a warmer, more welcoming environment, and her connections with local residents were crucial in bringing in new customers. Although Raphael still wasn't completely sure what it meant to have a relationship with Elena outside of her care for his mother, he couldn't deny the deep admiration he felt for her. Her support, her calm demeanor, and the way she understood what he was going through had helped him more than he could have imagined. However, not everything was perfect. The debts still loomed like shadows that didn't entirely fade, and while sales were increasing, the money wasn't enough to cover the overdue payments. The suppliers were still pressing, and the creditor letters kept coming. Raphael knew he couldn't ignore that reality. The days of immersing himself in the restaurant's tasks and forgetting about the financial troubles were no longer enough. There were moments when he felt the future was still uncertain. Still, something had changed inside him. The worries still existed, but they didn't suffocate him in the same way. He had found a new perspective. The restaurant was no longer just a burden, but an opportunity to connect with others, to build something that didn't solely depend on profits. Raphael spent an afternoon reviewing the accounts, payments, and projections for the next month. Though the business seemed to be on a better path, many uncertainties remained. That's when Casey entered the office, unannounced. She wasn't as good as him at reading between the lines, but she could tell when her father was overwhelmed. "Is everything okay, Dad?" she asked, crossing her arms with a concerned expression. Raphael looked up, and for the first time, he didn't try to hide the worry he felt. For so long, he had tried to be the strong one, the man who was supposed to lead the family, but now he understood that he didn't have to carry all the weight alone. "I don't know, Casey. We're better, but the debts are still drowning us. The suppliers want payment soon, and I don't know how we're going to make it. I've done everything I can, but I feel like we're on the verge of falling again." Casey moved closer to her father, sitting next to him. Her voice, although young, was full of a maturity that surprised Raphael. "Dad, you've done so much. This restaurant means more than you think, not just to us, but to everyone who comes here. The people in the neighborhood, the friends, the family. It's not just about the bills. It's about what you've built, what you've done for Mum, what you're doing for us." Raphael looked at her, feeling a wave of gratitude for her. Casey had matured faster than he had wanted, but at the same time, he saw in her the strong person he had once been. Something about her reassured him. She wasn't just his support, she was also his motivation to keep moving forward. "You're right," he admitted, with a shy smile. "Sometimes I forget what really matters. But you know, maybe we can't solve everything all at once. Maybe we just need to keep going, one step at a time." Casey smiled, and for a moment, they shared a sense of peace, even though they both knew the battle wasn't over. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, Raphael began to see things from a new perspective. He couldn't solve everything right away, but he now knew that something bigger was at play. The restaurant wasn't just a business, it was a meeting point, a place where people connected, and that, in the end, was more valuable than any balance sheet. One afternoon, while walking through the park after another day at the restaurant, Raphael and Casey stopped in front of an old fountain, as if it were a ritual. It was a place where, when he was a child, he used to make wishes, not knowing that wishes don't always come true, but decisions do. They stood there in silence, watching the water fall gently over the edge of the fountain, and for a moment, Raphael allowed himself to dream again. Although the future remained uncertain, in his heart, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. And he knew that, with his family by his side, he could rebuild what had been lost. The days continued to pass, and although the restaurant's financial difficulties persisted, Raphael found himself in a different state of mind. He was no longer alone in his struggle, and that had made a fundamental shift in his perspective. He had rediscovered the value of family, community, and the small daily victories that, though insignificant in the grand scheme of things, had a profound impact on his life. Despite all the effort he had put into revitalizing the restaurant, the bills remained a challenge. The debts continued to press, the suppliers kept demanding payments, and the shadow of uncertainty still hovered over his head. However, something had changed in the way he faced those difficulties. He was no longer so alone, and the support of Casey, Nino, and Elena kept him steady. There was something comforting in the fact that it wasn't necessary to carry the world's weight alone. Elena's words, so full of wisdom, accompanied him at every step. One afternoon, while Raphael was in the kitchen of the restaurant, overseeing preparations for one of the special nights, Elena arrived with a cup of coffee in hand, just as she always did. Since she had become more involved in the restaurant, Elena had become a key figure, not only for Mary, but for him and his family. Although she was still a nurse at the nursing home, her role in his life had evolved, and more, Raphael valued her presence and advice. "I see you're worried," Elena said, placing the cup on the table and observing the tension on his face. "You don't have to carry all this alone, Raphael." Raphael looked up, grateful for her support. "I know, Elena. It's just that, no matter how hard I try, the debts won't go away. There are nights when everything seems to be getting better, but then, the next day, the problems pile up again." Elena sat across from him, her gaze steady, and began to speak calmly, as if imparting a deep and necessary truth. "The fight for what you want won't always be easy. You already know that. But what's important is that you have something many don't. A family that supports you. Casey, your father, me, we're here to help you. It's like a rope, Raphael. You don't have to walk alone. You have to trust that, even when things don't improve right away, the effort is felt, and the small actions add up. Don't forget that." Raphael listened in silence, knowing her words were true. Elena wasn't just reminding him of the importance of community and mutual support, but also helping him understand that in the end, it wasn't just about solving immediate problems, but about moving forward, despite adversity. She reminded him that what he had been building wasn't just a business, but a family, a team that wouldn't let him fall. Over the following weeks, Raphael began to allow others to take more of a lead. Casey started taking on more responsibilities in the restaurant's administration, and although she still had much to learn, her enthusiasm and energy were a breath of fresh air. Nino also became his unwavering support, always ready to offer wise words when doubts crept in. The two began to spend more time together, not just at the restaurant, but in everyday life, looking for solutions together, finding ways to heal the wounds of the past. One day, after a long workday, Nino approached his son, as he always did, with a gesture of closeness only a father could offer. "You're doing well, son. I'm proud of you. Not just for what you're achieving, but for the way you've changed. Sometimes you get lost in the difficulties and forget what really matters. But you've found your way back to your family, to what matters most. Don't forget how important that is." Nino's words touched a deep corner of Raphael's heart. Sometimes, the burdens of daily life blinded him, and he didn't realize everything he had achieved. He had faced fear, loneliness, and had begun to rebuild not just the restaurant, but his life and relationships with his family. The nights at the restaurant, though still marked by constant work, began to have a different energy. Customers returned, drawn by the warmer atmosphere, by the family dinners that reminded them of old times. The stories Raphael had shared with those closest to him began to resurface, and with them, a sense of community that had been absent for so long. The restaurant, though still struggling, was no longer just a source of stress. It had become a meeting place, a place where human connections were woven through food, laughter, and shared stories. As the weeks went by, the financial problems remained a tough reality for Raphael to face, but he no longer felt powerless in the face of them. He knew that not everything would be resolved immediately, but there was something he had gained, the certainty that, although life was uncertain, his family and his community would always be his anchor. That night, after a particularly successful event, Raphael stayed alone in the kitchen, cleaning some utensils. Suddenly, Casey entered and leaned against the doorframe. "Dad, I think this is starting to work. People are starting to come back, and what we've done together is starting to bear fruit. Raphael looked at her, smiling with a satisfaction that had been hidden for so long. He had fought so hard to get to this point, and while the future was still uncertain, he now felt in control, knowing he wasn't facing the struggle alone. "You're right, Casey. We're doing something big. And not just for the restaurant, but for us. We're doing it together." From a distance, the laughter of the last customers leaving could be heard, and the atmosphere of the restaurant felt livelier than ever. Raphael stood there, feeling a deep gratitude for everything he had overcome. He knew there was still a long way to go, but he no longer faced it with fear. Now, he faced it with the certainty that he wasn't just fighting for a business, but for his family, for love, and for the community that had embraced him again. The sun began to set on the horizon, gently illuminating the walls of the restaurant. Raphael, who had spent so much time immersed in the daily struggle to survive, to keep the restaurant and his family afloat, now observed everything with a different perspective. The tables were full, the murmur of customers' conversations was welcoming, and the place seemed to be finally regaining its essence, the one it once had. There was something more in the air, something that couldn't be seen but could be felt. Life. The restaurant was no longer just a business. It had become a refuge, a home for human connections, a space where stories and laughter had a place again. Raphael approached a table where Casey was chatting animatedly with some of the regular customers from the neighborhood, a light but sincere conversation. The look in his daughter's eyes, which had always been so distant, now shone with the confidence of someone who knew what they wanted. She had become an active part of the restaurant, not only as a member of the business, but as a presence at the heart of everything that had been rebuilt. The distance between them had dissipated, replaced by a renewed trust that, although still fragile, was palpable. Casey looked up and smiled when she saw her father approaching. Raphael, feeling the warmth of that smile, sat down beside her. For so long, he had waited for this moment, to reconnect with his daughter, but he never imagined it would happen amidst so much chaos and pain. There had been so many broken memories between them, so much lost time. But now, finally, he could see Casey, not just as his daughter, but as an ally, a partner in the rebuilding of his life and his legacy. "Dad, do you realize what we've done?" Casey asked, her voice full of a mix of pride and emotion. "All of this, everything we've been through, has made us stronger." Raphael nodded, looking at his daughter with a shy but sincere smile. The memories of the wedding, the pressure of the debts, the dark days of loneliness, all of that was behind him. Life went on, yes, with its difficulties, but now it had a different purpose. It was no longer just about solving immediate problems or saving a business. Now, every step he took was with the certainty that, no matter what came next, his family was united, and that was what truly mattered. "I know, Casey. I never imagined I'd get here. But today, looking at everything we've accomplished, I feel proud. Not just of what we've done with the restaurant, but of what we are as a family. This is just the beginning." In the background, at a nearby table, Nino watched the scene with a serene smile, his gaze full of that silent wisdom that only time can bring. Although the traces of age and illness were present in him, his presence remained strong, like a pillar that had withstood all storms. It had been his father who had insisted on the wedding, who had pushed Raphael to face the truth and rediscover what mattered. Now, he just watched, knowing that what he had most wanted, to see his family united, was happening. Raphael stood up and walked over to his father. Without a word, Nino extended his hand, and they shared a brief but deep embrace, full of gratitude and understanding. It was a simple gesture, but it carried everything that had gone unsaid over the years. "Thank you, Dad," whispered Raphael, his voice breaking with emotion. He didn't need more words. Everything was said in that embrace. The night continued, and although the problems hadn't magically been solved, something inside Raphael had changed. He was no longer alone in his struggle. He no longer carried the weight of the world without sharing it. The community, his family, his daughter, even Elena, everyone was there, walking with him, giving him the strength to keep moving forward. In the days that followed, Raphael realized that life wasn't just about looking for quick solutions or resolving financial problems. No, life was deeper than that. It was about the moments you share with those you love, the family you build, the connections you make along the way. The restaurant was no longer a prison. It was a living space, filled with people coming together, laughing, and sharing their stories. He had regained its purpose, and with it, the hope that, although challenges would keep coming, he was no longer alone to face them. Elena, as always, was there, at every step, offering her support. Raphael began to see her as more than a nurse. She had been a beacon of light amid his darkness, and although he couldn't predict what the future would bring, he felt there was something deeper between them. It wasn't just friendship and respect, but a genuine connection, one that, without words, they both understood. Raphael's transformation wasn't immediate or simple, but the journey he had started years ago with the restaurant, his family, and his personal struggle had led him to an unexpected place, one where redemption wasn't found just in material solutions, but in human bonds, shared love, and the possibility of starting anew. In the end, the future was uncertain, yes. But what Raphael had learned was that with his family and his community, he could face any challenge. Because in the end, the true legacy wasn't in the restaurant or in the money earned, but in the ties he had rebuilt and the people who walked with him into this new beginning. Raphael's story teaches us that true redemption doesn't always come from solving immediate problems or looking for quick fixes, but from reconnecting with what really matters: family, love, and human relationships. Often we get caught up in the constant struggle for success, money, or recognition, forgetting that what really gives meaning to our lives are the bonds we create with others. The path to healing is neither easy nor immediate, but it is marked by small gestures of love, forgiveness, and the willingness to change. The ability to accept the support of others and heal emotional wounds is what, in the end, allows a man to not only recover his life, but also his humanity. Through Raphael's story, we see how the burdens of life can distort our perception of what truly matters. Raphael spent years immersed in stress, guilt, and loneliness, believing that the solution to his problems was solely in the numbers, in business management, or in the expectations he had of himself. However, it was only when he allowed his family to support him, when he stopped seeing the restaurant as a burden and began focusing on what it really brought to his life: love, relationships, community, that he could begin to rebuild his path. This process invites us to reflect on our own lives and how often we focus so much on solving tangible problems that we forget the emotional connections that sustain us. In times of difficulty, like those Raphael went through, it's easy to fall into the temptation to face everything alone. But it is in vulnerability and in accepting the support of others where we find true strength. The story reminds us that love, patience, and community are the forces that, in the end, can transform our lives in ways deeper than any material success or external achievement. Raphael's journey isn't just about a man recovering his business, but about a person rediscovering what it means to be truly human. In each of us lies the capacity to do the same, to recognize that moments of pain and difficulty are opportunities to grow, to forgive, to reconnect with what really matters. In the end, it's not what we achieve, but how we love and how we are loved that leaves a lasting imprint on our lives. Thank you for joining us on this story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and activate the bell for more content. See you in the next video.